When my father threw my packed suitcase onto the wet driveway, his face was deformed with pure rage. He called me uneducated trash and screamed, "Get out, you lowlife! You are a parasite on this family's name." Right next to him, my golden boy brother, Cameron, smirked, whispering that I'd be begging on the streets by sunset. Everyone thought I was utterly ruined. My father's lawyer even begged me to grovel, saying I was throwing away my entire existence. Instead, I just looked me family in the eye, smiled coldly, and said, "Fine." I picked up my bag and walked out into the rain. They thought they were discarding a worthless failure. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the woman they just kicked out had quietly built a business empire worth $20 million, and the next morning, their entire world was going to collapse. My name is Blake, and I am 27 years old. If you want to see how far a story of absolute betrayal and quiet triumph can reach, follow along with me until the very end, and comment below with the city you are watching from. Standing on that rain-slicked driveway, watching my past wash away, I didn't shed a single tear. For my entire life, my father and my older brother, Cameron, viewed the world through a lens of rigid old money elitism. To them, value was measured solely by Ivy League degrees and prestigious corporate titles. Because I chose a quiet, non-traditional path, spending my nights locked in my room starring outlines of code instead of networking at country clubs, they labeled me the family failure. Day after day, I endured their relentless biting remarks, their cruel laughter, and the suffocating assumption that I was nothing more than a lazy, unproductive burden. They looked down on me from their high horses, completely blind to reality. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy playing the part of high society moguls, the quiet, self-taught daughter they dismissed as uneducated trash was actually building a revolutionary tech venture from scratch. I didn't need their validation, and I certainly didn't need their permission. I kept my head down, built my business empire in the shadows, and let them believe whatever lies comforted their fragile egos. But as I picked up my suitcase, the time for hiding was officially over. Cameron was always the golden boy who could do no wrong in our father's eyes. As the eldest son, he was handed the reins of our family's legacy logistics company, a business built on decades of hard work and community trust. But Cameron lacked our father's early grit. Instead, he possessed a dangerous mix of arrogance and recklessness. Behind his expensive tailored suits and smug smiles, he was drowning. Over the past year, Cameron had secretly made a series of disastrous, high-risk investments, draining the company's reserve capital to cover up his mounting failures. As the financial walls began closing in on him, he realized he needed a scapegoat to deflect our father's looming wrath. That was when he set his trap for me. Utilizing his admin access, Cameron systematically manipulated the company's digital ledgers, creating a fabricated paper trail that made it appear as though large sums of family assets were being funneled into an anonymous offshore account. An account he claimed belonged to me. He played on our father's deepest insecurities and long-standing prejudices against my lifestyle. When he presented his evidence, our father didn't even bother to ask for my side off the story. The trap sprung perfectly. Cameron's frantic lies transformed my quiet independence into treacherous theft in our father's mind, culminating in that explosive confrontation in the grand foyer. My brother stood in the shadows, smirking behind his hand, completely confident that his financial sins were permanently buried beneath my ruin. The tension in the grand foyer was suffocating when the family lawyer, Richard, arrived carrying a crisp manila folder. My father had summoned him in a frantic rush, demanding emergency papers to permanently strip me of any future family inheritance. Cameron leaned against the marble pillar, his arms crossed, watching the execution of my social standing with absolute glee. Before the formal signing, Richard pulled me aside into the courtroom, his eyes filled with genuine panic. He whispered frantically, begging me to drop my pride, drop to my knees, and apologize to my father. He warned me that signing these documents meant walking away into absolute, inescapable poverty. I just looked at him, completely unbothered. I walked back out to the mahogany table, picked up the sleek silver pen, and signed the papers instantly. There was no hesitation, no trembling of my hand. I left my signature on the page with a calm, freezing smile that made Richard's face turn completely pale. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost, sensing a hidden shift in power that he couldn't quite articulate. Meanwhile, Cameron let out a triumphant laugh, openly celebrating his victory as he raised his glass to my father. They genuinely believed they had just successfully neutralized a threat and ruined my life forever. As I picked up my single suitcase and walked out the heavy front doors into the pouring rain, I didn't feel broken. I felt entirely free. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear sunrise. At precisely 8:00, I was sitting comfortably in my sprawling minimalist high-rise office downtown, sipping a warm cup of coffee while looking out over the city skyline. The environment was a stark contrast to the suffocating negativity of my childhood home. Here, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass and the quiet hum of servers, I was entirely in control. I opened my laptop, pulled up our primary corporate dashboard, and looked at the final automated transfer protocols. With a single, deliberate stroke of the keyboard, I authorized the immediate cessation of all external capital injections. Meanwhile, across town at the family mansion, a completely different kind of morning was unfolding. My father sat at the head of the long breakfast table, unfolding his morning financial papers, while Cameron greedily reviewed the daily market openings on his tablet. But the smug satisfaction from the previous night evaporated in a matter of seconds. My father's eyes widened in horror as he stared at the live business portals. Their logistics company's stock was in a violent, unprecedented tailspin. Panic instantly shattered the morning quiet. For the past 2 years, Cameron's devastating operational deficits had been completely masked by a massive anonymous institutional investor who regularly bought up their debt and injected fresh liquidity into their accounts. Cameron had survived on that hidden lifeline without ever knowing who was holding the puppet strings. But on this specific morning, that anonymous savior had vanished completely, pulling every single dollar of funding out of the business. Within minutes, the family legacy wasn't just struggling, it was actively collapsing into total bankruptcy. Complete and utter chaos erupted inside the corporate headquarters of the family logistics firm. Phones were ringing off the hooks, and frantic executives were running down the corridors as line after line of credit was abruptly frozen by the banks. My father and Cameron locked themselves inside the main office, their faces completely drained of color as they desperately tried to contact the parent conglomerate that held the vast majority of their high-interest corporate debt. They needed answers, and they needed them immediately, but every single one of their urgent outgoing calls was being systematically rerouted. Eventually, Cameron managed to track down the digital origin of the freeze, which led him straight to an elite, highly secretive tech investment firm operating out of the city's premier financial district. Snorts desperate to salvage what was left of their crumbling reputation, my father seized the phone and aggressively demanded an emergency face-to-face meeting with the chief executive officio, negotiate a temporary restructuring of their loans. He yelled into the receiver, claiming that a massive administrative mistake had been made and that their family name was too prestigious to be treated with such casual disregard. The corporate secretary on the other end of the line listened to his loud, angry tirade with absolute unbothered professionalism. When my father finally stopped to catch his breath, her voice cut through the tense silence of the office like a razor blade. She calmly informed him that the principal owner of the conglomerate was already fully aware of their impending bankruptcy, their fraudulent financial history, and their total lack of collateral. She then added that the owner had personally authorized the foreclosure. My father demanded to know her identity, and the secretary replied smoothly, "The CEO's name is Blake." My father and Cameron broke land speed records driving down to the corporate headquarters, convinced there had to be a catastrophic clerical error. They burst through the double glass doors of my executive suite, breathless and sweating, ready to demand heads on a platter. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the words died in their throats. There I sat, leaning back comfortably in the premium leather executive chair, framed by a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I took a slow sip from my coffee cup and looked at them with absolute freezing indifference. The look of sheer, unadulterated horror on Cameron's face was worth every single night of grueling, isolated work. My father trembled, his voice barely a whisper as he gasped out my name. I didn't give them a chance to play the victim. I calmly spun my laptop screen around, displaying the ironclad legal documentation of my software empire, a self-taught tech venture now valued at a staggering $20 million. I revealed that while they were busy mocking me as uneducated trash, my company had quietly acquired every single ounce of their outstanding corporate debt and high-interest bank loans. I legally owned their business, their brand, and the very roof over their heads. The daughter they had brutally discarded just 12 hours earlier was now the absolute master of their financial survival. They stood frozen, completely crushed beneath the weight of my quiet success. Cameron dropped to his knees, frantically begging me to sign a bailout agreement, while my father stammered out a hollow apology, suddenly claiming that family meant more than anything else in the world. But I felt absolutely no sympathy. I completely refused to rescue them from the disaster they had created, allowing the banks to swiftly foreclose on the grand mansion and liquidate Cameron's remaining personal assets. They were forced to leave high society behind and finally live with the real, devastating consequences of their own arrogance and greed. With my family legacy permanently dismantled, I turned my full attention away from their toxicity, using my wealth to establish a global foundation dedicated to funding young, brilliant entrepreneurs who were also told they would never amount to anything. Now, I am incredibly curious about all of you who have stayed to listen to my journey until the very end. What would you have done if you found yourself standing in my exact shoes on that rainy driveway? Would you have walked away as cleanly as I did, or would you have fought them right then and there? Please leave your thoughts and comment below. Meanwhile, I am leaving 2 other incredible stories on the final screen right now that are massive channel favorites, and I promise they will definitely surprise you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.